Hi. So I did a video yesterday about somebody asked me, am I too old to recover? And I wanted to follow up, having read some of the comments, and then I think that it's a really, what's the word? People don't realise a lot of the time in older people, or they don't recognise eating disorders. I remember when I was a kid, there was this woman who lived in our village, and she was kind of old and relatively thin, but not super thin, but she was definitely funny around food. She was always baking. She'd baking lots of gorgeous stuff. And she'd bake lots of food and give it to everybody else. And she'd never eat. And in my parents' village, it's a very social village, so people are always having people around for dinner and things. And she'd often come to dinner and she'd bring some delicious home-baked pie or something, but then she wouldn't eat anything at the dinner. She'd always say, oh, I ate earlier, or and honestly, nobody thought very much of it. It was just, oh, that's old so-and-so, and she's a bit eccentric. And that's, I think, a word that gets used a lot in villages in England about people if they're a bit eccentric. There was this other guy who was the husband of one of my mum's really good friends, and he was definitely described as eccentric. And he would never even come to dinner parties or do anything like that. He would never go to anything social. His wife used to come, but she always had to leave at 10 o'clock at night to go home and bake him his omelette. Like, she had to cook him an omelette every night at 10 o'clock at night. And everyone's just like, oh, well, that's just so-and-so, that's just what they're like. And now, as an adult and as somebody who's relatively educated in eating disorders, when I look back, I'm like, they had eating disorders. Like, it seems really damn obvious to me now. The more I think about it, the more I'm like, that's definitely an eating disorder. But no one would have even thought of that at the time. And I think a lot of that is because the stereotype is that people with eating disorders are all teenagers. And if they're not teenagers, they're young and female. And the more I think back to my childhood, those are just two examples of what I could probably put to many people that were highly likely had an eating disorder. And so I think that especially if somebody is over the age of 50, 60, 70, 80, they just get overlooked for it. And they're just considered, oh, that's just them and that's just their old ways. And it's almost like, oh, they could, they just carry on like that. But maybe they're really actually unhappy like that. So it's just a bit of a strange one, isn't it? And I don't know what the point of this video is, other than to say, look out for it more. Don't just assume that somebody who is older and is a bit weird around food doesn't have an eating disorder. Don't just assume that's just them being a funny old so-and-so, because it may not be. It's a difficult one to bring up, that's for sure. Especially people who themselves probably have this stereotypical idea of what an eating disorder is. And so then if you say to them, I think you have an eating disorder, they're like, what? That's something that neurotic teenage girls get. So that's, I think, the biggest part of the barrier there, is not just healthcare providers only thinking that people with eating disorders are teenage girls, but also just the general public. That was one of the things that stopped me understanding that I had an eating disorder for so long, is because I thought just teenage girls had them. So I just think it's an interesting one to look out for, and it just doesn't have to be that way. I honestly do believe that you can recover at any age. I know that you can recover at any age. I've worked with plenty of people that have, but I think half of the problem for people who are older who have eating disorders is it being recognised in the first place that they've got an eating disorder. All right, bye.